Welcome back to another episode of Creedle. It is another episode of What a Week, and I'm joined, as always, by Andrew Petiprin. Andrew, how are you?
I'm very well, Zach. How are you?
Also doing very well. As you know, I was in the office today, in our Chicago office, and had to sprint home on a train walk. It was more of a brisk walk to the train, so I wouldn't miss it, and then brisk walk from the train station home, so I could make it in time for us to do the recording. But I made it. We're here in one piece and ready to go.
That's just the kind of guy you are, man. You just go the extra mile.
Well, I don't know about that, but yeah, it was just as you know, it was an unexpected visit today, complicated by an unexpected trip next week. And so, the domino effect, one thing led to another, ended up having to go to the office today and knock out some stuff, got it done. And here we are. So, but I'm glad to be with you. How are you? How are things where you are?
Things are very well. I'm preparing to go on a trip to London, as I was just telling you before we started recording, which is a big deal for me. I haven't been back to England since 2004. So a long time ago, but that place, I spent 3 years there, and that place very much formed me in all kinds of different ways. So I'm really eager to go back, and it's a work trip. I'm going to be participating in a conference and doing some other stuff. And I'm getting pretty excited, although I'm a little nervous about leaving my family for a week. I don't know.
Yeah.
Have you had to leave your family for that length of time?
Well, yes. When I was in the military, I did a 4-month deployment, and I do not recommend that. That was definitely not fun. And yeah, highly stressful, certainly longer than a week, but really ever since then, and even before then, whenever I would leave for any length of time, there was even more than like one night. It is definitely hard, and it's a little bit stressful. So I understand the stress. I mean, but being transatlantic is another thing entirely. So, a work trip, we fly from Dallas to Chicago, for example, is not as significant as Dallas to London. So yeah, my prayers with your family for sure.
Thank you. Yeah.
Now you studied in Oxford, obviously, graduate school. When you were in Oxford, did you spend much time in London? Is that a city that you're very familiar with from your time there?
Well, I spent a little bit of time in London, but I lived in London my third year in England, actually. So I did my 2 years at Oxford, got my master's degree. I was all set to keep going. I was all I had been approved for research status and moving on to the DPhil. And then I just decided to drop out. I mean, my supervisor just kind of never heard from me again. It was a weird situation. And it had to do with my own sense of vocation. I had an opportunity to go and work in this church in London. So I ended up just kind of doing it almost spur of the moment. It's kind of a weird thing.
Yeah.
But I spent a whole year in London, and I love it very much. I look forward to seeing what's changed and what's stayed the same.
Yeah, I certainly haven't traveled as widely as I have wanted to, but I've traveled fairly widely around the world, and London is my favorite city that I've ever been to. I just think it's phenomenal. It's fantastic. It's humongous. There's so much to do there. The public transportation is amazing.
Yep.
It's relatively clean. The culture scene is incredible. The history there, obviously, it's rivaled by some of the great cities in the world, but it's no American city can hold a candle to the history of London, for example. So
yeah,
it's just a really cool place. I absolutely love it. And I'm a bit jealous of your trip, but hope it's a really fun time.
I hope so too.
Look forward to getting the report when you get back.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, well, let's start with some listener feedback this week, Andrew. And this is going to be new feedback to me. I have not heard what this listener wrote to you about, but you got some feedback from a listener. And I think it's about one of our misinformation segments from last week. But like I said, I'm going to be mostly surprised. So let's do that.
Yeah, this was exciting. I thought it shows that we have people out there listening to us. And this was a friend of mine named Justin. Hi, Justin, if you're listening.
Hey, Justin.
He's a longtime listener of the Creedle podcast. He's not only he wasn't listening just for me. In fact, he's been a fan of your broadcasts for a long time, Zach. And but he has continued listening in our weekly podcast. And
great, glad to hear it.
I happened to have arranged to have lunch with him the day after we published last week's podcast, and he said, "Hey, I want to talk to you about this AI wrapper thing." So to catch our listeners up, if they didn't participate in last week's show, you shared an article called "Capitol Records Cuts Ties with AI-Generated Rapper FN Mecca Over Racist Stereotypes." That was one of your misinformation articles. And it turns out that it was true that, you were trying to stump me on that one, but it's true. There's an AI rapper. Well, in our discussion, Zach, we got into this a little bit, and Bobby Mixa was with us last week, but we got into this a little bit, that obviously the big story, the lead, right, is the kind of the racist part of it in a way, right? Like there was kind of this like I read the article again, and it talked about how this AI generated rap included. It said it perpetuated some black stereotypes, and it even used the N word, right? And this is like AI generated, and so people, rightly so, got kind of upset about this. But this friend of mine brought to my attention something we touched on a little bit when we were discussing the article, but he really wanted to go further with it, and I really loved what he had to say, namely that there's just this much bigger problem, right? The whole idea of a computer creating art.
Yes.
And we touched on this a little bit, but he had some really good points that he made to me in our conversation and that he shared with me in a text after that, just kind of saying we really need to be heralds of the kind of the good news of art, in the sense of art needs an artist, that that it is a part of our nature as creatures of a creator that we desire to create. That's what art is all about, right? That there's a will behind it. Like, even if it just looks like splattered paint on a canvas or something like that, it is like attempting to express something that is unique to the human condition. So he talked about, this friend of mine talked about how art captures reality. In some respects, that's what we're trying to do. And so if it's artificial intelligence, if it is sort of by nature not real, then it is incapable of expressing a participation in, an appreciation of, a critique of, whatever it may be, of reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I thought all of that really hit the mark. But then he made one point at the end, and I'm just going to read this part of the text that he sent to me to express, I think, something pretty profound.
These are his words that you're about to read.
These are his words right now that I'm about to read. These are my friend's words. Here's what he has to say kind of in conclusion. I wonder what your take will be on this, Zach. He says, ultimately, this is a horrifying vision of the world put forward by tech billionaires and multinational corporations to automate everything, eliminate the human element, to build a world where every aspect of life is about efficiently creating a product that you will consume. They don't want people with dignity and agency. They want consumers. Human flourishing, he put that in quotes, human flourishing for these big tech companies looks like the fat people on the spaceship in the movie WALL-E, just scooting around in their space vessels, slurping down space slop and binging Netflix and Hulu and listening to AI-generated SoundCloud rap until their hearts explode. I thought that was a really nice addition to the conversation that we had.
I have not seen the fat people on the spaceship in WALL-E. I've never seen the movie WALL-E.
You must.
That was. Is it good? Is it worth it?
I think so. Yes.
Okay.
I like it.
There was a time, I don't know when WALL-E came out, but there was a time when I watched every Pixar release every year religiously. And then I think somewhere around The Incredibles, I was like, yeah, I could probably take it or leave it for these. And then a few years ago, I was like, yeah, this is just not the same that it once was. But anyway, I digress. Have not seen WALL-E, but Justin's depiction of, Justin's characterization of the idea of human flourishing for the sort of tech oligarch, for the modern businessman or businesswoman is, I think, painfully accurate and disturbingly accurate. That is certainly they don't look at us as human beings. They look at us as consumers. That is the entire ethos of the tech industry, to maximize eyeballs in front of screens. That's why, I mean, even linguistically, as Justin correctly points out, we're users. We're consumers. Mm-hmm. So consumers are a word that's used in big market studies, and then users is normally the terminology used in the internal documents of businesses that are trying to maximize essentially eyeballs in front of screens. And that's all it is. I mean, that's what matters. It's how many people can we get in front of the screens. It's especially so in the advertising industries, and that is the case for Google. Google is just built on a giant ads network. And it is also the case, people don't realize this, but for Amazon, I mean, Amazon is serving you ads all the time. Every time you see a sponsored post in an Amazon search result, which is pretty much every time you search for anything on Amazon, that is advertising. So Amazon has a giant, mostly in-house advertising agency already, and it serves you ads. Netflix just announced that they're gonna launch an ad-supported tier And I was just seeing today, there's a report that they're going to be able to charge, double what cable TV charges for commercials on a cost per 1,000 impressions basis, because they have the people who are, as Justin describes, fat and just eating the mass-produced food and watching the mass-produced stuff. Yeah, I love that. I love that summary, and I think he's right. We did touch on it. You're right. This idea of the problem of digitally created art, and I think I mentioned that I've listened to a couple of AI songs. You click one of these like BuzzFeedy type articles. It's like, you won't believe an AI made this song, and it's just like, it just sounds horrible. And my response was basically, yes, I 100% believe that an AI wrote that song, because an AI doesn't have the consciousness to recognize what is beautiful.
Right.
So I had literally never heard of this FN Mecha quote character. Avatar is what it really is. Until this article. I just thought the entire article was ridiculous. But to Justin's point, it does get at something more disturbing. The most disturbing thing is why, independent of any racial stereotype perpetuation, which I agree is bad, independent of any of that, why in the world is Capitol Records signing an AI rapper in the first place, right?
Yeah.
It's taking away any of the problematic racial elements of this digital avatar. Why in the world would you do this? This is just a ridiculous decision by a label completely from the beginning.
I think that's really the mystery of that story. I'd love to see a follow-up story. Maybe there's some digging to be done about that. Maybe they thought, yeah, I mean, it's just so strange. Like, what did they hope to gain? What was that about, trying to sign this AI rapper? I don't get it.
But well, we know the answer, though. At a high level, the answer is money. Somehow, this translated to money for them, and as soon as it no longer did, they cut him. It's not as if they didn't know about these problematic racial stereotypes or the use of the N-word, as you pointed out. No label signs an artist without listening to that artist's catalog and saying, like, is this something we want? It was only after the backlash started that they were like, oh, I guess we can't make the money we wanted to make, so we're going to release a big public apology statement and yada, yada, yada. And it was obviously a giant PR disaster for them in the end. But yeah, it's all about money. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Well, it actually ties into our close read today, but
does.
we'll get to that after misinformation. Any other comments on Justin's feedback or reaction to what we had last week?
I think that's it, but it's great to get feedback. And one of the things I look forward to is coming back to some of these things that we've talked about. And I think the misinformation section is an interesting area for us to kind of tease out just little bits of information or stories, and then think about them some more, and then maybe come back to them or receive some feedback and react to them for that reason.
Yeah, completely agree. I'm enjoying the misinformation segment. And as I was looking at my computer, preparing to give you the first one here, Andrew, I just saw a tweet from a friend of mine from about a week ago. Maybe a few days ago. I guess it's a few days ago. Dan Hitchens. Do you know Dan?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah,
okay.
I do know Dan.
So Dan was a friend of mine in Oxford when we were studying there. He was getting his DPhil in English. He's a Samuel Johnson scholar. I don't know if you know Samuel Johnson or have read much of him. I've not read much of him, but I know about him a bit through Dan. Dan's just a great guy, Catholic convert, and I agree. I love Dan. Mm-hmm. But so this is not going to be misinformation because I'm telling you exactly what it is right now. But honorable mention, we'll call it that. This is an honorable mention for the misinformation section. The Guardian published an article by a guy named Peter Young, and Peter Young wrote that this woman, I'm guessing this is a Vietnamese name, Nguyen Thi Phuong Thao, and I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but Peter Young writes that this woman will be the first minority woman to have her name on an Oxford college. So there will be a new Oxford college apparently named after this woman. A reader wrote into The Guardian and said, but 2 colleges founded in the 14th century were named after a Jewish peasant woman living in Roman-occupied Palestine 2,000 years ago. They are the House of the Blessed Mary the Virgin in Oxford, commonly called Oriel College, of the foundation of Edward II of famous memory, sometime King of England, and St. Mary's College of Winchester in Oxford, known as New College to avoid any confusion with Oriel. Among later foundations, St. Anne's College is named after Mary's mother, and St. Catherine would probably also fit the criteria.
I think Mary Magdalene would as well. My college, Magdalene College.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
So to the Guardian's credit, they published this letter, but I thought that was just a
Wow.
fantastic piece of how I would have prompted it to you is something like, true or false. The Oxford has announced that it will name its first college after a minority woman, and that would obviously be false.
That's false,
as Stephen Shaw has pointed out. Okay, but I actually don't know who the person, the Vietnamese woman is whose name I read. I'll have to do a little bit of digging on that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's see. You ready for your misinformation segment here, Andrew?
I am ready. Let's do it.
We have, I don't think we mentioned this to the listeners, we've streamlined this. Rather than me giving Andrew 3 and Andrew giving me 3, we're just going to rotate every week. I'm going to give Andrew 3 today. Next week, Andrew will give me 3. So let me figure out the order that I want to do these, Andrew. Okay. I think I've got it. Misinformation, item 1. In a recent profile in the online magazine The Cut about Meghan Markle, the writer was describing a story or telling a story from Meghan in which, quote, Meghan recalled a moment from the 2019 London premiere of the live-action version of The Lion King. Quote from Meghan, if this is true. I just had Archie. It was such a cruel chapter, I was scared to go out. End quote. And then the writer describes, a cast member from South Africa pulled Meghan aside. Quote, he looked at me and he's just like light. He said, I just need you to know, when you married into this family, we rejoiced in the streets the same we did when Mandela was freed from prison. Okay. So there's item 1. Okay. Meghan Markle tells a story to her profiler of how someone pulled her aside and said, when you married into the British royal family, we celebrated like Nelson Mandela was freed from prison. Okay. That's item 1. Item 2. In California, which is undergoing a massive heat wave right now as we speak, prayers up for our California friends. One response from the state has been that they have encouraged people to not run their large appliances for too long and to not charge their electric vehicles. This action coming only days after announcing that in 2035, gas vehicles will be no longer able to be sold at all in the state of California. That's item 2.
Okay.
Item 3. Bank of America announces a 0 down payment, 0 closing cost special mortgage program for Black and Hispanic first-time homebuyers. Residents in select Charlotte, Dallas, Detroit, Los Angeles, and Miami neighborhoods will be the first to be offered the program, which is limited to, as I said, first-time Black and Hispanic homebuyers. That is item 3 of misinformation. That one from NBC News. Okay. What do you think is the misinformation here, Andrew?
All right. Well, I believe that the first one is true, and I would like to discuss that further. Would you like? Would you like to? Well, I heard this story, so unless so you have like slipped something in there, which you may have done to deceive me. I believe that is true, and that is just an astonishing thing. I mean, okay, if somebody says something like that, just in kind of a, I don't know, a moment of enthusiasm or something. Okay, if you're Meghan Markle, you just sort of take it and move on. But to kind of broadcast that is pretty wild, I have to say. So I believe that one's true. I don't know if you have more insights you want to share about that.
It is true. That is the insight I will share right there. The funny thing to me, after that excerpt that I read, the funny thing to me is the quote from Meghan Markle ends. And then, is she still Meghan Markle? Did she take last name? I think she's Markle, but
what last name would she have taken anyway? Windsor? I don't know. Interesting.
I guess. The Duchess of Windsor is.
I once saw Prince Harry in his uniform, and it said Wales on his.
Interesting.
Thing, which I thought was weird that it would
first
maybe
name
if it was
Prince,
his brother,
middle name of.
But he's not even the Prince of Wales, right?
Yeah.
I don't get it. Maybe it was his brother. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe one of our listeners knows the answer to this.
Because it's William is the Duke of,
and he's not the Prince of Wales yet either. But their dad is the Prince of Wales, so maybe that's why it's Wales.
Okay, yeah, last name Wales.
I really don't know. I think
she still goes by Meghan Markle, but more frequently the Duchess of Windsor. Is that right? Is that the royal title?
I think it's Sussex, isn't it? The
No,
Duchess
it is
of
Sussex. You're right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is Sussex.
It's Cambridge. William and Kate are Cambridge, and I think Harry and Meghan are Sussex.
You're absolutely, yeah, that's right. It sounds much more correct to me. Right. We're such Americans, Andrew. Just
I know, man. Even though we've lived in England, it's like
trying to parse out the royal party titles. This is great. So the funny thing is, after that quote from Meghan, the profiler, the writer goes on to say, of course, she knows she's no Mandela, but but perhaps even telling me this story is a mode of defense. Because if you are a symbol for all that is good and charitable, how can anybody find you objectionable? How can anybody hate you?
Right.
Really remarkable.
I mean, it's like, it's like she might as well have said, one time this person said, "You remind me so much of Jesus."
Yeah, exactly.
Or something. I mean, where do we stop with the analysis that journalist put on it?
Amazing.
What a wild story. You know that they're going to have a reality show, by the way, apparently. Harry and Meghan. Yeah.
Wow.
I've heard this.
I am a pretty typical American, I think, in that I mostly tune out everything about the royal family. So when there was that whole kerfuffle between the Duke and the Duchess and the rest of the royal family, I really was pretty tuned out on it. But most of the things that I've seen about them do not really commend them. Do not really reflect well on them ever since the departure. So the fact that there may be a reality TV show built around their life is completely ridiculous to me.
Pretty much.
Yeah. Anyway, I have no further comment on that, but it is true. So now you're down to the California one and the Bank of America one.
Okay. I'm going to say that the third one, the Bank of America one, is true. And I'm going to say somehow that second one the second one seems true, but it seems sort of too true. So I'm going to say the second one's false. The third one is true. And you can explain to me how I'm right or wrong.
Yeah, there's strategy involved in my choices here, Andrew, because sometimes you think that the sort of too believable one has to be false and the too unbelievable one has to be true. But it actually, in fact, the California one is true in this case, and the Bank of America one is false. But I have more things to say about each of those. So we'll start with the California one. So yes, just a couple weeks ago, I think California passed a ban that will come into effect in 2035 on gas vehicles. My understanding is that the ban is not on those vehicles being driven on the roads, but on being sold in the state.
The sale of new ones, yeah.
That is my understanding, yes. And then the heat wave comes, and the California power grid is in bad shape. People give Texas a lot of grief over its power grid. You live there, you would know better than I, but I think a lot of that's warranted. The power grid it's in desperate need of modernization, but the same is true in California. So when these hot days come on and everyone's running their AC full blast, it really strains the power grid. And California is trying to take steps to limit the effect of that. And so one of those is telling people to keep their thermostats above 78 degrees. Another one is don't plug in your large appliances if you don't need them. Don't have empty refrigerators running. Don't run, air compressors and whatnot. And don't charge your electric cars. But the irony is just amazing, given that, just a couple weeks ago, they said, we're not going to have any more gas cars ever in the state starting in 2035. Also, by the way, don't charge your cars. It's going to take too much energy and we can't sustain that. So you would think that a proper policy, a sensible policy would say, let's modernize our electric grid. Let's prioritize that so we can make sure we won't have the energy problems that we have now. And as part of that, let's modernize our automobiles, but that's not what has happened. So
it does seem like, with regard to cars, that there's a certain type of person who seems to think that electricity is a kind of like magic manna from heaven or something like that. If it's going into a car, like get an electric car, save energy. Well, The energy comes from somewhere. And in fact, if everybody's plugging in these electric cars, that seems like it's going to be a pretty big drain on.
There's a lot of coal being burned to bring the electricity to your Tesla.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. There's a guy that I really like named Michael Schellenberger who read a book called Apocalypse Never. Mm-hmm. And he described himself as, kind of a dyed-in-the-wool progressive. And in fact, an environmentalist. He's been an environmental activist for decades. But his book, Apocalypse Never, is really good because he says basically, if we're going to fix the climate, we need to have serious, honest conversations with each other about what is apocalyptic and what is not apocalyptic. And here's the science on how the earth can in fact heal itself when, we have done damage through deforestation or plastic in the ocean or whatever the case is. And here are the real problems that we face. And here's how nuclear energy is a huge part, has to be a huge part of the energy answer for us, and how, the sort of the radical elements of environmentalists have made nuclear energy advances much more or less impossible across the world in the last 30 years. And he's talked about this specific issue in California and has said that the future, if there is one, a future for clean cars, it's in hydrogen fuel cell cars, which are not here yet, but hopefully it will be. And that's where we should be investing, because electric cars are actually not that efficient compared to, just burning gasoline in your engine. So
right.
I'm not a car guy. I can't independently verify that information, but he's not the first person I've heard say that either. I think the answer is probably something, the Teslas of the world are a bridging solution. So to say that that's the future of automobiles is probably not thinking creatively enough.
Yeah, I wonder about that. I wonder if we're kind of in like the laser disc phase of cars, like when the LPs were replaced with laser disc, and it seemed like, oh, this is the way it's going to go. And then all of a sudden it was like, nah, actually, this isn't going to be the best way to deliver music at home. And then they disappeared and the CD replaced them. So,
yeah.
And then
or even the CD, because the CD was clearly an interim solution as well.
Yeah,
I mean, who has a CD now, right? Everything's just digital.
Well, I still have a lot of CDs actually, Zach.
I mean, I used to. I think my CD, well, maybe I still do, but yeah, I mean, I certainly had a CD collection once upon a time. But my kids, well, that's actually the bad example. We get CDs from the library, and so my kids listen to them a lot. But most people I know who are our age do not do CDs. They just do, iTunes or more commonly.
It's true.
Spotify
I do it too,
days.
and I kind of don't want to. I really love the ritual of like actually having an object and putting it on and looking at the liner notes and all of that.
I've thought of doing that. We have a couple of CD players that my kids use, but if I were going to go full on, I want the ritual of putting it in, I think I'd just go record player and just buy records.
I do that too. I do that too.
Yeah.
But actually, records are actually very expensive if you buy new ones, and so they're kind of a treat to buy one.
But the sound of a record player is so irreplaceable.
Oh, it's the best. I mean, the music is on the object. It's really just an incredible thing. I'm a big fan.
Totally agree. It's not ones and zeros. It is actually literally physically encoded into the that's cool. All right, the third one is false, but there's a twist here. I like to do this with some of the false ones. I like to sometimes point out where there is misinformation. So in this case, this is an article from NBC News. As far as I can tell from Twitter screenshots that I see, the initial version of this article had this headline: Bank of America announces 0 down payment, 0 closing cost mortgages for Black and Hispanic first-time homebuyers. Very explicitly, implying very heavily that this would be for people of color only, right? The real headline, or the headline was later changed to this: Bank of America announces 0 down payment, 0 closing cost mortgages for first-time homebuyers in Black and Hispanic communities nationwide. So this is not this is clearly, this is targeting communities where Black and Hispanic people live, in majority Black and Hispanic communities. But this is not a program that is only open to people of a certain race. That would certainly run afoul of civil rights law.
Right.
So they can't do that, which is a good thing. But I think this is also potentially a bad thing. I mean, it's hard. I'm not a mortgage specialist, and I haven't seen the numbers to be able to say if these are actually subprime mortgages. But we know where subprime mortgages get us, and that's the 2008 subprime crisis. So the best thing for people is to not charge them exorbitant interest. There's nothing wrong with a mortgage as long as it is reasonable and it is not, it's not based on usury, which is charging excessively high interest.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is that the entire mortgage industry is built around excessively high interest, so that when you buy a $200,000 home, over the course of that loan, you'll pay hundreds of thousands of dollars simply in interest, which is just absolutely absurd.
Right.
So there are two problems I have with this. One, you're doing a disservice to a home buyer when you offer them a mortgage on terms that they very likely will not be able to meet, right? If you're offering them like this, a 0 down payment term that then leaves them with a much higher principal over the life of the loan, and obviously much, much higher interest over the life of the loan, that's bad and actually disadvantages them. and disadvantages them in a way that perhaps they won't understand. Mortgage math is complex. I don't even fully understand it, right? Like I understand the basics, that there's a lifetime of the mortgage. I understand there's a principal, you pay down your interest over time. There's amortization stuff. I understand the basics, but mortgage math is complex, and it's quite easy for a predatory loan officer to take advantage of someone with some eye-popping numbers that you can get, through discounted rates your first year or whatever, and then it pops up, or you like an adjustable rate mortgage, for example. I mean, very simple to take advantage of people with this. So that's one possibility here. And the second is simply that this program, I mean, I think the cynical view of this program, which I tend to take, is that this is really designed to just bring more and more people into the Bank of America mortgage ecosystem so that they can be taken advantage of, because the mortgage system in America is pretty predatory already without your individual loan officer being malicious. The entire system, the edifice, is built on usury for sure. And is pretty predatory in general. So this is overall a bad thing, although Bank of America obviously is treating this like, they're patting themselves on the back that they're anti-racist and all of this, because they're, wrapping more and more people in Black and Hispanic communities into their exorbitant mortgage system. So that is my problem with it.
Yeah, I think I share your concerns. I know even less than you do. I've had 2 mortgages in my life, and it's all kind of witchcraft to me. So that's interesting.
Well, that is the conclusion of the misinformation segment, Andrew. That is it. You almost got it. You thought a little bit too hard on this one. It was the obvious answer was in front of you.
It's tough. I'm going to get in your brain eventually, Zach. I always tell this with my kids.
One of these days.
I tell them, how to succeed in school. I was like, I always did well in school because like I could quickly figure out what the teachers wanted. You just get in their brain and then you succeed. And I'm like,
That's exactly right.
Let me get in your brain, Zach.
One of these days.
Yeah.
All right. Should we move on to our close read today?
Let's do it.
All right. So this one is in Tablet Magazine. I found it, and Andrew, as you know, we were texting last night about this. It's called The Great Debasement by Alice Gribben. And I started to read it last night. So I sort of read the lead, and it was recommended to me in a newsletter that I get by Connor Friedersdorf called The Best of Journalism. And I was like, this looks great. This looks like it's up our alley. It's a lot of the things we talk about. This is not about the death of art, but this is about the debasement of art, meaning sort of the exploitation of art, or the reduction of art. And I thought this was going to be great. And there are things about the article that are really good. I think the article really hits its stride in the second half, Andrew. Mm-hmm. But really through the first half, I was like, man, this must have been a lot longer in the beginning. And then some copy editor hacked it down, because it just reads really awkwardly through the first third to half of the piece, I thought, and was kind of tough to get through. I don't know if you had the same reaction I did.
I did. Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts about this article. I thought parts of it were very good. The issue with the beginning, I think, I'll just put this on the table and then maybe circle back and say some other kind of foundational things about what Alice Gribben is saying in the article. But I agree that it did feel like there were things that were sort of hinted at, but then not developed. And then something else was moved on to, suggesting that maybe it was longer and there were kind of more pieces. And one of the biggest pieces that I think was teased out, but wasn't developed in full, was the idea of kind of what's going on with the art market. Did that strike you as odd? Like it sort of teased out like the art market is just this sort of, wild, out of control, kind of world unto itself, know, which I have read some things about that, which are quite good. Actually, I even listened to a podcast series by, of all people, Alec Baldwin, who did a multi-part series on his regular podcast, which I don't listen to regularly, by the way, but I just heard about this series.
You're an Alec Baldwin devotee. Every week, new Alec Baldwin episode.
I don't know how many people are gonna get me when I have to be honest about this, but I certainly do like Alec Baldwin as an actor in many ways. But
do you really? Wow, I've never been an Alec Baldwin fan.
I do. I think that his comedic timing, especially on things like 30 Rock, is just genius. I really think he's great. But odd guy.
Based on what I've seen, I think 30 Rock's probably his best work, and it was all kind of downhill from there. But I'm open to have my mind changed.
He's been in a bunch of great movies. He's great in Beetlejuice. He was really good in the 80s and in some of the things he was in the 90s. But anyway, I digress. Yeah, he's an odd guy. He's got a lot of problems. But anyway, he did this podcast series about art, mainly because he himself was duped when he tried to purchase it was at least a 6-figure piece of art. I think it may
Wow.
have been close to 7 figures. And so he ended up doing this whole podcast series about kind of deception and forgery, but also just kind of the sheer amount of money and just kind of the insanity of the kind of the value of art itself. It's really strange. You may have heard, I don't know, Zach, I've heard on a few podcasts that I listen to, advertisements for investment schemes where you can like buy into pieces of art, which is an interesting thing. I don't know much more about it than just that I've heard that. But obviously it is a wild market, the art market, right? So
yeah, what I've heard about the art market is that so there is that thing. I've had advertisements for those like fractional share services where you can buy a piece of not a physical piece, but a share of a piece of art. But the other thing is that I've heard about. I've heard these Middle Eastern oil oligarchs use art as a means of basically diversifying their personal portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the world's most valuable, from a monetary standpoint, art is owned by, for example, Saudi princes and oil sheikhs, who then just go to these private auctions or send their people there and bid on it and buy 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 figures worth of art and then collect it in their basement. So a lot of the world's art is not on display in museums and everywhere it should be probably, but rather in some Saudi sheikh's basement.
Well, and this Alec Baldwin thing that I listened to implied that there is a fairly good chance that some of those pieces are not even real.
I've heard that as well. Yes.
Which is really an odd thing. And I think that then ties together, like eventually where the author is going with just kind of thinking of these pieces of art as, on the one hand, these valuable commodities. Like these museums have these things. So it's like, they're not just going to put them away and say, you shouldn't look at them. But they're full of all this like so-called problematic stuff, right? That then requires a kind of like explainer all the time, right?
Right.
And then, so then to set up how we arrive there, the author's opening line is, artworks are not to be experienced, but to be understood. And then kind of lays out the idea that we're in this like utilitarian moment, which I think is very, very true. We're in this utilitarian moment, even with regards to the finest things, which is a really odd place to be sure. Now, maybe you have some
just
thoughts
reference
about
our just real quick, reference our earlier conversation about users. The utility, right, refers to the use of something. So a user, thinking of one of your customers as a user, is a very utilitarian way of looking at your customer. Even
absolutely,
again, where our whole world is built around utility right now.
Absolutely, and I want to get into this utilitarian thing particularly with regards to this like understanding part. I think that there's something. And it actually ties to the conversation that we had about higher education, I think, to some degree. But I do want to flag one thing at the outset, which is, I think that the author's statement here, artworks are not to be experienced but to be understood, is not entirely correct as an assessment of the way that we think about art nowadays. Because I think equally true is the idea that art is only to be experienced and not understood. And one of the ways I think this is true, but I think it still plays into this same idea of like the commodification of art and to some degree the utilitarian nature of art, but kind of from a different perspective. Here's the example that I'm thinking of. There are these exhibitions now of the Van Gogh experience or the Monet experience, right? So it's like they're offering consumers. Again, they're not looking at the real paintings, which is a topic that I want to explore here. I think that's a really interesting point, right? They're not looking at the real paintings, but they're invited into this experience, which is actually like deliberately billed to them as, hey, you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to know what's going on here. These are really cool things to just kind of like get into them. Like pretend you're at Giverny, like standing on the water lilies, or like you're looking at the church at Auvers, or whatever it may be, right? So like, I guess I would have wanted that kind of included along with this point that she's making about this like very highbrow aspect of the art world now being so utilitarian. But there's also this like popular flavor of it, which is utilitarian in one respect, but it is very much about experience, not understanding. So I'll throw it back to you. With that.
No, I think I agree with that. You have a better understanding of these experiential exhibits. I have not attended one of them. I'm not super familiar with them. As you've described it, it sounds rather horrible. I don't know why you would attend an experiential visit about an artist that didn't actually incorporate the artist's work.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of cool if you think of it the right way. If you think like, okay, Van Gogh is a really incredible artist. Let's go see this, and then like let's make a plan to go to the Museum of Modern Art or to the Orsay Museum in Paris or something, and like really, really experience the painting.
Yeah,
right?
And that makes sense. To me, I think that line was sort of strange as well, because I agree with you. It is not always about understanding. There also is this emphasis on experience. To me, the line is not so much about experience versus understanding, but rather about this actually goes back to our conversation last week about epistemic humility, even in the face of great literature. What can we learn from this literature? So it's, to me, the line is about is artwork there for us to co-opt, or is artwork there for our instruction? And I think that is really a better dividing line that the author is talking about here, because she goes on to describe at great length this exhibit that I think was in London, right?
Yeah, I think it was at the Tate Britain.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yep, by painter and printmaker William Hogarth, and she describes many of these pieces, but more cogently, she describes the exhibit itself and the exhibit's descriptions of these pieces. And almost all of the descriptions were taken from academics, modern academics in either literature or art. In some cases, I think history, all of which had some sort of specialty in something very postmodern, like, I don't know, sex and gender studies or anti-colonialism or whatever. And it featured these comments on the painting, and every single comment without fail that she highlights here, at least, is sort of reading a meaning into the painting that is, in all probability, very different from the meaning that the painter of the piece had in mind when he painted it.
Yeah.
And so there is this very intentional effort to co-opt rather than to sort of learn from. And that, I think, is a more appropriate dividing line than the sort of experience understood thing.
Right. And I think they would say, well, we're not trying to say what the painting means, maybe, but what we are trying to say is like, well, they are trying to say what the painting means, but the meaning that they're finding in it is something that that is completely, I don't know. You've already said it, but maybe I'll just use an example, right? Like, so if there's a chair in a painting from the 18th century, right? The meaning of the chair, right, is like the presence of the chair in the painting ought to signal to us something about the transatlantic slave trade, about colonialism, about something like that. Like, we're supposed to say, like, where did that chair come from, right? Yeah, please do.
Yeah. So this is based on, this is a piece in the exhibit called, I think, an Artist at Work by William Hogarth. And I'm looking at the painting right now. It's literally a man sitting on a Chippendale style chair with a palette of paints in his hand and a paintbrush, and he's looking at a canvas, and he's working on the canvas on just a typical sort of tri-stand easel. And so she describes this, and the author of this piece says, in a self-portrait of the artist at work, the chair in which Hogarth sits, quoting from the exhibit itself, literally supports him and exemplifies his view on beauty. The chair is made from timbers shipped from the colonies via routes which also shipped enslaved people. Could the chair also stand in for all those unnamed black and brown people, enabling the society that supports his vigorous creativity? And you look at the art. It's a chair.
Right. First of all, is that even true? I mean, it could have been made out of the oak tree in his backyard. We don't even know
exactly.
that, right?
I know. It's completely unprovable. I mean, I don't know. Ridiculous.
Yeah. It is. And, there's this line here about how, the whole attitude then towards it is, there's this quote here, a painting is a pictorial facsimile of its period's ruling ideology. Right? So, even a portrait, right? Even a portrait is not, what interests us is not the person, right? Or some kind of like humanity that the artist is able to, by his skill or her skill, like sort of evoke, that connects us to sort of something about what it means to be alive. Rather, the portrait is a type, right? So the portrait then, all it does is signal to us certain things about class, race, gender, inequality, like whatever it may be, right? Rather than just the experience of a human being looking at the rendering of another human being made by another human being in another era and letting it somehow speak to us, to mean something to us, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the problems with this piece, I think, is that the author seems to be saying, and she says this early on, that artwork should be experienced, and that experience is an entirely subjective one. At least that's how I read her. So rather than sort of having this co-opting attitude where you look at a piece and says, "What is this?" and you say, "What is this expose?" She says, "Exposing," or "What is this revealing?" What can I deconstruct given this painting that's in front of me? Rather than doing that, you need to sort of sit from a position of humility and experience the painting. And I think that's true, but I don't think that experience is entirely subjective. I do actually think that paintings should reveal things. In fact, the feedback from Justin said this, right? Art is supposed to reveal reality. Um, and so to me, the problem is not actually that these scholars are reading the wrong thing into these, or it's not that they're reading into these paintings and sort of trying to draw out some truth from them. The problem is that the thing that they're drawing out is just not true, right? And so, as an example, to the point about the portrait, there was one, I think it was actually a bust. She did talk about a portrait, but the example I'm thinking of is about a bust. And this bust, I'm trying to find the exact painting here, or the exact bust. Okay, so this is a bust by Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux, and the bust is called "Why Born Enslaved," and it is a slave woman. And let me find the description of it. Okay, so this is the author of the piece writing. Fictions of Emancipation, Carpeaux Recast, was mounted, that's the name of the exhibit, was mounted at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City this March and is set to run for a year. It centers around a single sculpture within the museum's permanent collection, and that's what I described. A life-sized marble bust of a bound, semi-nude enslaved woman modeled in 1868. It is one of the most well-known works of 19th century abolitionist art. So it turns out this Carpeaux, who made it, is an abolitionist, and this is a powerful abolitionist piece of art because it's showing this woman in her full humanness, in her full femininity, fully a human, just like you and I are human beings, Andrew. And so this has been known as a very strong and powerful piece of abolitionist art. But the commentary on here says, while the subject's resisting pose, defiant expression, and accompanying inscription have long been interpreted as conveying a powerful anti-slavery message, the bust also visualizes long-standing European fantasies about the possession of and domination over Black people's bodies.
Right.
What?
Again, I mean, what a wild assumption, right? I mean, the author the artist's stated purpose is to create something beautiful, which is a reflection of his desire to see injustice come to an end, right? And then in the future, it's read back into his intentions that, well, he said that, but actually he was just probably fantasizing about.
He was like a crazy, an erotically disturbed racist, basically. Yeah.
It's very odd, and it goes back to what you were saying before about kind of the objective subjective thing, right? Of course, like what we're always interested in the truth, right? So of course we're interested in the way in which art. I mean, certainly the author's intentions matter, or the artist's intentions matter to some degree. Like it is important to ask, what were they trying to do? What were they trying to say? Now, at the same time, the thing about art is, it's precisely because we're not the Borg. We don't all share the same brain. We don't all have the same feelings, right? That art affects us in kind of our individuality, but I mean, that's just the nature of being alive. I mean, some things make us feel a certain way, make us think certain things. One of the things I thought the article did pretty well was mentioning in a couple of places just the way that exposure to the same piece of art or different pieces of art over time can have different effects. I mean, you can come into kind of a deeper appreciation of some truth by engaging with it more. Or maybe you see it and you kind of think, yeah, there was a time when I understood something really true and beautiful and good, but this doesn't do it for me anymore. I'm just not really interested in this, right? That's the wonderful thing about art. I don't know if we're ready to jump to more or less the conclusion, but I just thought ultimately, it was a fairly interesting article that had one very good piece of advice at the end of it, namely,
Yeah, let's go to that.
don't look at what the placards say when you go look at paintings in a museum. I
Yes.
mean, that's just one
Yeah.
easy thing you can do to make your experience of art much more enjoyable.
Right. I think the same goes for English. To refer back to our previous conversation last week about William Derezuwitz and his struggles in the academy. Every scholar who's anybody these days, and she talks about this in the early part of this piece, they need to have certain things on their resume, and they need to talk about certain things, and they need to talk about the right things more particularly. And so everyone ends up saying the same thing. And it's just, how can I look at this piece of art and read in the most deconstructionist, Foucaultian, Marxist, anti-racist, postmodern interpretation that I possibly can? And that will be, then I will have achieved originality.
Yeah.
Which is super obnoxious.
Yeah, and there's a point. I think you're hitting on a point that is another thing that I think the article probably maybe did in an earlier draft flesh out more, but alluded to in ways that piqued my interest, namely the relationship between this sort of misfortune or this sort of debasement or whatever in the art world and kind of the collapse of the humanities in academia. Just literally like the lack of jobs. We have these people with PhDs walking around, and then you have this like art world that is so flush with cash. So you have this like interesting convergence, right? It's like you have like museums who need people with degree letters after their name to describe what people are seeing. And, these are people who come out of the world who say, who have sort of a message. I listen to this guy called The Critical Drinker. He's a film reviewer and a really wild guy in Scotland, but he talks about the message all the time in modern media. It's like you're just watching something and just going along, and then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, where did that like total non sequitur about this and that come from? And this seems to be kind of what's happening in the art world too. It's like the message above all.
Right. Right. Yeah, it makes me wonder 100 years hence, what would be the interpretation of the Hogarth paintings? It would probably be something slightly different, Yeah, because it is the least interesting thing in the world, I think, to interpret a piece of art strictly on your own terms. And that's what all these people end up doing. So, I mean, I think her advice is good. Don't listen to the experts. Again, my problem with the piece is that I don't think that art is strictly supposed to be experienced. I think it is supposed to reveal. I think it is supposed to stir something in our souls. The problem with the art, the examples she gives, is just that these people are not letting it stir their souls in the right way. It's like they're resisting, and they have to impose their own terms on it.
Right. In fact, it's sort of implying that consumers of high art and high culture actually, they just want the right answer. Like they actually kind of don't want to experience it.
Totally.
They sort of want to know how they should think about it, which is, I certainly have encountered that with people's reactions to other things too, films, politics, whatever it may be. Right.
Yep. Absolutely right. Any further thoughts on this, our close read for the day?
I think that's all I've got.
Great. Cool. We are now moving on to the recommendation section. I will say just briefly, loved getting the feedback from Justin. Justin, thanks again for writing to Andrew with your thoughts. We would love to hear from anybody else who has thoughts on this. What's your philosophy of art, for example? What did we miss in the Great Debasement? What would you add to the conversation? We'd love to read that on next week's show. So definitely send us a note if you can. Without further ado, though, Andrew, what's your recommendation for this week?
All right. My recommendation for this week is this book by Joseph Ratzinger, which is called A Turning Point for Europe. I don't know if you've encountered this book.
I have. I've not read it, but I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
Yeah, I had never read it, and I'm working on one of my projects. My book projects that I'm working on is about European film, kind of modern European film, 1990 to 2020. And I'm very interested in the way that philosophical and theological themes are explored in kind of this new European context after the Cold War, and then into kind of, post 9/11, and then into kind of all kinds of stuff that's been going on in Europe for the last 10 years and where we are now. Obviously, it's a whole new thing with the invasion of Russia and Ukraine and stuff like that. I'm not really getting into that in my project, but I wanted to go back and look at what John Paul II, and then also what Ratzinger, Pope Benedict had to say just about Europe itself during this incredibly tumultuous transition time. And this book, A Turning Point for Europe, came out in German in 1991. It was translated into English, I think, a couple years after that. But it is a really fascinating book, and I think still resonates, even though Europe has changed a lot since this book came out.
I've heard it's quite prescient.
It is very prescient. I mean, in a lot of different ways. I mean, and one of them is in a way that I think really has to be reckoned with, which is what to make of Christianity in a continent that is inherently Christian. I mean, Europe. I mean, you can break it apart. You can put it back into tribes. You can do something else with that massive land if you want to. But calling it Europe is founded on the identity of Christianity. First Catholicism, and then obviously in a more fractured way after the Reformation. But Ratzinger really explores that profoundly in this little book, and he gets into other things too that as you say are prescient. I mean, he thinks about terrorism and drugs. He thinks about technology. He thinks about things that are going to be like real issues that he thinks like this new Europe is going to have to reckon with. And at the end of the day, he really says most of these problems are the result of a kind of longing for reality. It's almost a kind of mystical. The question is sort of more spiritual and mystical than it is kind of economic and practical and geopolitical and stuff like that, right? So highly recommend this book. I've used it for my work, and I've read every page of it with a pencil, and I think it is just terrific.
That's great. I love that. Mine is certainly less intellectual than that, but enjoyable. This is a piece from 2013, I think. Some of our listeners may have heard of Grantland. It was a long form site that was attached to ESPN. It was not exclusively about sports, and it ended up getting shuttered. And then its founder, Bill Simmons, eventually started The Ringer, independent of ESPN. But this is one of Grantland's greatest pieces ever, I think, by a guy named Brian Phillips, and it's called Out in the Great Alone. And it is a very, very, very long, small book length profile of the Iditarod, the sled dog race that happens every year in Alaska. So we just finished August. We're in September. Labor Day weekend's right around the corner. The weather will turn cooler eventually, Andrew, and maybe some people can enjoy thinking of cooler days ahead while they read about the Iditarod in this fantastic work. So a bit of a non sequitur, but I had forgotten to come up with a recommendation for this week, and I was like, I'll have to look at some of my favorite long form pieces done over the years, and this is a great one. So
I have not read that.
Would recommend that.
Maybe I'll print it out and take it on the airplane with me when I go across the
you should
ocean.
For sure. I think you'd enjoy it a lot. So that is it for this episode of What a Week. Again, if you want to just send us some feedback, please do. Zach@credopodcast.com or Zach and Andrew at credopodcast.com. And we would love to read your feedback on the show. We're going to try to bring you a show next week. It's going to be a little bit tricky with Andrew's. Actually, I'm traveling as well next weekend. So we both have travel, but we're going to try to get an episode out next week. So you can expect that. And our apologies in advance if it doesn't work out. But thanks again for listening to another episode. And until next time, God bless you.